The morning Elena walked into the sprawling mansion didn't feel like any ordinary first day of work. She had answered a job ad for a nanny, expecting a quiet household, a playful child to care for, and a few polite adults, nothing more than routine, predictable, and mundane. What she did not expect was a house that radiated quiet authority in every polished corner. Walls lined with expensive artwork that seemed to watch her with silent judgment, and the air, heavy yet subtle, that hinted at power she couldn't yet identify. She stepped into the grand foyer, holding her bag tight against her chest, heart hammering, not from intimidation exactly, but from the sheer weight of unfamiliar luxury that seemed designed to command obedience. The large wooden doors swung shut behind her with a soft, definitive click, echoing like a proclamation. Once you enter, you are part of this world, whether you want to be or not. Her first encounter with the child she was supposed to care for was abrupt. Little Luca, handsome, clever, and surprisingly serious for a 6-year-old, stood with a toy car in his hand, his eyes studying her as if assessing her worthiness to exist in his world. "Are you going to be my nanny?" he asked bluntly, tilting his head, curiosity sharp and intuitive, and Elena laughed softly, trying to mask nervousness. "Yes, that's the plan," she replied, crouching slightly to meet his gaze. But as she straightened, the click of polished floors announced movement behind her, and she turned to see a man for the first time, a tall, impeccably dressed figure whose presence was calm but unmistakably authoritative. He did not speak immediately. He did not smile. He simply observed, eyes dark and assessing, like a predator measuring the terrain before deciding the next move. Elena assumed he was the child's father, but something about the silent intensity in his gaze suggested there was more to understand, something deeper hidden behind the courteous silence. The house staff had whispered hints about him, Mr. Moretti, but no one seemed willing to elaborate. And as he finally spoke, his voice smooth, commanding yet carefully neutral, "I hope Luca's first impressions are satisfactory." Elena felt her stomach twist nervously. She nodded, clutching her bag tighter, aware that every movement was being evaluated. Luca ran to him suddenly, wrapping arms round his leg in a way that spoke of comfort and deep attachment. Elena realized that the man's presence alone could command loyalty effortlessly, even from a child, and she could not yet comprehend how such authority existed so naturally, so quietly. Over the next hour, Elena found herself juggling tasks while under his subtle but constant observation. Every toy arranged, every bottle prepared, every movement analyzed. She told herself it was normal for employers to watch, for children to test boundaries, but she could not shake the feeling that there was a hidden weight behind every glance, a presence she could not yet name. And then, just as she thought she had understood the rhythm of the household, a casual conversation with a housemaid revealed the first clue. "Mr. Moretti is not who you think he is," she whispered, glancing around nervously. Elena's heart skipped a beat, curiosity and apprehension colliding, because she had assumed she was merely working in a wealthy household. She had no idea that the man silently observing her every move was a mafia boss, and the stakes of her job were far higher than she could possibly imagine. The first 2 minutes of her arrival had already set the stage. A cheerful, inexperienced nanny thrust into a world of quiet authority, hidden power, and invisible rules, where one misstep could unravel the safety she believed she had walked into. Elena smiled bravely at Luca as he giggled and chased after a rolling ball, pretending she was prepared for the day. But deep down, she felt the first stirrings of fear and fascination intertwined, because the man silently watching from the corner did not simply observe. He was already calculating, already measuring her worth, already establishing the challenge she did not yet know she had accepted. And in that quiet tension, the story began. The story of a nanny, a child, and a man whose true identity was far more dangerous and compelling than anyone could imagine. Elena spent the first few days learning the rhythm of the Moretti household, balancing mealtimes, story hours, and school preparation, all while keeping a careful eye on Luca, whose intelligence often surprised her beyond his tender age. Yet every small task, every moment of apparent normalcy, carried an undertone she could not name. There was a subtle awareness in the house, silent footsteps on polished floors, the occasional glance from the towering figure who remained mostly in the background, and whispers among the staff that hinted at events she could not fully comprehend. She noticed locks on doors that led to empty rooms, security cameras hidden in the corners, and the way the child sometimes referred to Papa with a reverence that carried more weight than she was accustomed to hearing in ordinary families. And gradually, Elena realized that this household, so carefully orchestrated and seemingly normal on the surface, was layered with invisible rules and expectations, a world in which one mistake could ripple consequences far beyond her comprehension. The first sign that danger was real came subtly, but unmistakably. One evening, Elena was carrying dinner to Luca when she heard a sharp knock on the door, followed by hushed voices arguing just outside her line of sight. She paused, heart racing, straining to catch any intelligible words. "He's seen too much. Keep her close," one voice whispered. A shadow moved quickly past the window, and for a fraction of a second, Elena felt the weight of unseen eyes, calculating, evaluating, waiting. When she returned to the dining room, she found the tall man she assumed to be Luca's father standing silently by the window, his silhouette sharp against the city lights, gaze penetrating, unreadable. There was no anger, no overt aggression, only a quiet assertion that he had noticed, that he had evaluated, and that he had already begun weaving her into the intricate fabric of his world, a world where loyalty and survival were inseparable. Elena swallowed hard, realizing that every decision from that moment onward would carry consequences she could neither predict nor escape. Over the following days, subtle patterns emerged that unsettled her. She noticed how Luca seemed unusually perceptive, how he would sometimes mimic the man's expressions or pause mid-conversation as if testing her reactions, and she realized that he had been trained, quietly, unknowingly, to observe and measure the people around him. Elena began to feel the invisible tension of being both caretaker and observer, her every gesture scrutinized by both child and father in ways that transcended conventional authority. The tall man rarely spoke to her directly, yet his presence alone was a constant reminder that nothing in this household was accidental. Even casual moments, pouring tea, folding laundry, reading bedtime stories felt like tests, deliberate or unconscious, and Elena was painfully aware that passing or failing them might carry consequences she could neither negotiate nor escape. Her curiosity, naturally strong, led her to ask small, seemingly innocent questions about the household staff, the schedules, and the child's unusual intelligence, but each answer only deepened the mystery. "Mr. Moretti prefers discretion," one maid whispered softly, glancing nervously toward the main hallway. "Discretion is survival here." Elena felt a shiver run down her spine. She had assumed she was merely a nanny in a wealthy household. Now she realized that she had stepped into a world where power was absolute, loyalty was currency, and secrets were as carefully guarded as gold. And as she glanced toward the tall man standing silently at the far end of the living room, arms crossed, expression unreadable, she understood the first truth of her new life. She was under observation, evaluated continuously, and had no choice but to adapt. The climax of the tension that week arrived when Elena accidentally stumbled upon a confidential room in the mansion, its doors unusually reinforced, its contents shielded by layers of secrecy. Inside, she glimpsed documents, security layouts, and photographs that confirmed her suspicion. Luca's father was no ordinary man. He was a force of power she could not yet quantify, someone whose influence extended far beyond ordinary boundaries, someone whose world was dangerous, calculated, and highly organized. Panic and fascination collided within her, leaving her breathless. She understood in that instant that she was no longer simply a caregiver.
She was a participant in a story of stakes far higher than she had anticipated, and that her presence, her decisions, and her instincts would now shape not just a household, but the delicate and dangerous web of a mafia empire that existed quietly, invisibly, but undeniably around her. By the end of the week, Elena had accepted an uncomfortable truth. She had entered this house as a nanny, but she was now entwined with a man whose identity was shrouded in secrecy, whose authority was absolute, and whose attention, whether protective or scrutinizing, was inescapable. Every smile, every command, every quiet observation carried meaning she could not yet decipher. And the first spark of a connection, one part fear, one part fascination, had already been ignited. The stage was set for challenges, revelations, and an intimacy neither of them had anticipated. And as she tucked Luca into bed that night, hearing the faint creak of footsteps from above, Elena realized one undeniable fact. The story had only just begun, and she was already caught in its gravity, whether she was ready or not.
Days passed, and Elena began to notice subtle patterns in the mansion. How Luca's father moved through rooms silently, how he seemed aware of her presence even when she thought she was unobserved, and how he influenced situations with a mere glance or a quiet word that carried weight beyond what any ordinary parent could wield. One afternoon, while preparing lunch for Luca, Elena heard footsteps approaching, soft but deliberate. She looked up to see him standing at the doorway, his expression unreadable, yet there was a tension in the set of his shoulders that hinted at both scrutiny and curiosity. "You handle him well," he said quietly, voice calm yet authoritative, and Elena felt her heart skip a beat, realizing that this was not casual praise. It was recognition delivered with a precision that made her aware of the invisible hierarchy in the house. She nodded, unsure what to say, aware that any misstep could alter his perception of her permanently. Later that evening, as Elena tucked Luca into bed, the child whispered questions that hinted at his own awareness of his father's world. "Why does Papa always watch me like that?" Luca asked softly, eyes wide in the dim light. Elena hesitated, struggling to find a way to explain the quiet authority and intense presence that governed the mansion without frightening him. "Because he cares," she said carefully, realizing that was only partially true. His father did care, but his methods were shaped by a world Elena could not yet comprehend, a world of power, secrets, and silent influence where even small mistakes could ripple into danger. Luca nodded, seemingly satisfied with the answer, and Elena felt the first flicker of understanding that part of her role was not just caring for him physically, but navigating the delicate boundaries between innocence and the hidden complexities of his life. The tension escalated further when she accidentally overheard a conversation in the main hall, a hushed, serious discussion among the staff, speaking in code and concern. Words like safety, watching, and unforeseen exposure floated to her ears, confirming her suspicions that the mansion was more than a luxurious home. It was a fortress, and she was unknowingly at the center of its carefully orchestrated equilibrium. Panic and curiosity mixed within her as the realization settled that the man she assumed to be just a protective father was, in reality, a powerful figure whose decisions affected more than just the household. And yet, despite the fear, Elena felt an unexplainable pull toward understanding him, toward navigating the subtle dynamics of this dangerous world with intelligence and caution. That night, she encountered him on the terrace, leaning against the railing under the soft glow of lanterns, the city sprawling beneath them like a glittering map of possibility. "You've seen more than most," he said calmly, eyes fixed on her, and Elena swallowed hard, aware that he did not question her knowledge. He acknowledged it, measured it, and waited for her reaction. I try to pay attention," she replied, voice steady though nerves stirred. A faint smile touched his lips, almost imperceptible, as if pleased with her answer. "Attention is survival here," he said softly, and in that moment Elena realized the full weight of her position. She was not just a caretaker, but a participant in a life of calculated choices, invisible rules and silent power. Every word, glance, and movement mattered, and the quiet tension between them began to take a subtle emotional shape, trust mingled with fear, awareness with attraction,
and the beginnings of an unspoken bond formed under the shadow of his authority. The following days tested her in ways she could not have anticipated. Luca challenged her at every turn, often echoing the man's own methods of observation, testing her patience, cleverness, and instincts. Elena realized that the child's intelligence and precocious behavior were not accidental. He had been carefully guided, subtly molded to navigate a world Elena only glimpsed in fragments. Yet amid the subtle games of observation and behavior, small moments of genuine connection emerged. A shared laugh over a spilled cup of cocoa, a quiet story read together under the soft lamplight, and fleeting glances from the father, brief but charged with an intensity she could neither ignore nor fully understand. The mansion, which had initially seemed overwhelming, began to feel like a stage on which every interaction mattered, where danger and trust, power and intimacy began to intertwine in ways that Elena could neither control nor predict. By the end of part 3, Elena fully realized that her simple plan of being a nanny had been replaced by a far more intricate challenge. She had entered a household governed by a man whose identity and influence were concealed, whose intentions were precise yet unpredictable, and whose attention was now irreparably fixed on her. Every choice, every interaction, and every moment of trust became part of a delicate dance between caution and courage, fear and fascination. And as she glanced toward him one evening, watching him stand silently in the shadows while Luca slept peacefully, Elena understood the inescapable truth. In this house, nothing was as simple as it appeared, and the story she had stepped into was only beginning to reveal its depth, its danger, and its subtle, slow-burning emotional pull.
Elena's routine as Luca's nanny had begun to feel deceptively normal, but the illusion shattered the moment she noticed subtle signs that the mansion was far from safe. One evening, as she prepared the child for bedtime, a faint noise reached her from the large windows overlooking the gardens, footsteps too deliberate to be innocent, shadows moving in the distance with calculated intent. Her heart raced instinctively. She had learned to read tension through the faintest cues, taught now not by experience, but by survival instincts sharpened in days of subtle observation. Without a word, she signaled Luca to stay inside, quietly moving to check the windows, only to see the dark outline of figures retreating as if their approach had been anticipated. The realization hit her with a jolt. Her presence in the mansion was being monitored, not just by the staff or the child, but by invisible forces outside, and she was now a part of a world where vigilance could mean the difference between safety and catastrophe. The tall man, Luca's father, appeared silently behind her, his presence both startling and strangely reassuring. "You noticed them," he stated, not as a question but as an observation. Elena nodded, unable to fully articulate the mixture of fear and relief she felt. His gaze softened, but only slightly, as if acknowledging her awareness while also emphasizing the invisible rules she had yet to learn. "This world is not like the one you came from," he continued, voice calm yet filled with authority. "Discretion, caution, and observation are the currency here, and you are now part of it." Elena felt the weight of his words settle over her like the mantle of responsibility she had not anticipated. She had entered the mansion to care for a child, but she now understood that her role carried layers of consequence she could not ignore. Over the next few days, the tension escalated in subtle but undeniable ways. She noticed that security had become more active. Rooms she thought were private now had silent monitoring, and Luca's father's presence was increasingly deliberate, never intrusive, always commanding. Every glance from him carried unspoken scrutiny. Every interaction seemed layered with meaning, and Elena began to realize that he was not merely observing her work, he was assessing her character, her instincts, and her ability to navigate the hidden complexities of his life. Yet, amidst the quiet intensity, moments of unexpected connection began to emerge. She saw him smile softly at Luca's playful antics, witnessed his gentle, protective gestures, and glimpsed flashes of vulnerability in his otherwise unshakable demeanor. These small glimpses were intoxicating, making the mansion feel simultaneously dangerous and strangely intimate, a paradox that left Elena both wary and intrigued. The first significant confrontation arrived when an intruder attempted to access the mansion's perimeter under the cover of darkness.
Elena, moving instinctively, alerted the staff and Luca, while the man she now knew as more than just Luca's father arrived with silent precision, neutralizing the threat before it could escalate. Elena watched, both in awe and with a creeping fear, as he moved with an effortless authority, calm but deadly, a force of power she had only glimpsed through rumors and hushed warnings. The event left her shaken, but also strangely drawn to the man whose control of life, danger, and circumstance was absolute. It was in that moment she realized that her role as Nanny was inseparable from navigating the invisible currents of authority, power, and protective calculation that he embodied. The emotional tension between them deepened in the days that followed. Small gestures, a quiet word of caution, an unexpected smile, a protective stance when she least expected it, created a complicated web of awareness, attraction, and cautious trust. Elena found herself studying him in return, recognizing not just the danger, but the intelligence, restraint, and subtle charm that defined him. She realized that in this household, connection and survival were intertwined. Trust could be earned, and fear could be transformed into respect, fascination, and an undeniable pull that neither of them had consciously chosen, but both could not deny. By the end of part 4, Elena understood fully that her journey had evolved far beyond the simple expectations of a nanny. She had entered a world of hidden power, invisible rules, and quiet danger, and she had begun to forge a delicate balance of trust, awareness, and subtle emotional engagement with a man whose authority was absolute, whose protection came with silent consequences, and whose presence had begun to occupy a space in her heart she had not expected to surrender. The story had grown richer, more dangerous, and undeniably more personal, setting the stage for revelations, challenges, and slow-burning romance that would test both courage and emotional resilience in the days to come.
Days had passed since the attempted intrusion, and Elena began to notice subtle changes, not just in the household, but in herself. The mansion no longer felt like a place of intimidation. It had become a stage where every interaction was a test, every glance a measure of trust, and every small gesture held meaning she could now decipher with growing confidence. Luca had grown increasingly attached to her, laughing freely during story time, confiding in her with secrets only a child could hold. And Elena realized that her protective instincts extended far beyond normal caregiving. She was navigating a delicate balance between nurturing innocence and surviving the invisible currents of power surrounding the boy. And as she observed Luca's father, standing quietly in the hall, she noticed small cracks in his otherwise impenetrable demeanor, moments where his eyes softened, where his tone lost some of its quiet command, and where the human warmth beneath the authoritarian exterior shone through. One evening, as Elena prepared Luca's bath, she heard his father moving silently toward the nursery. She froze instinctively, aware that his presence could be both protective and intimidating. Yet instead of intrusion, he offered subtle assistance, fetching towels, arranging bath toys, engaging with Luca in gentle, unobtrusive ways. Elena watched, her heart pounding, as the man she had feared gradually revealed a side of himself that was deliberate, controlled, and yet profoundly human. He did not speak excessively, did not demand attention, but his quiet involvement was impossible to ignore. Elena felt a strange mixture of relief and curiosity. Relief that danger had been neutralized, curiosity at the layers of his character slowly unfolding before her eyes. She realized that trust, even tentative, was beginning to form, not just in her interactions with Luca, but in her perception of the man whose presence dominated every aspect of the mansion. That night, Luca fell asleep faster than usual, curling against the warmth of his blankets, and Elena allowed herself to breathe. She thought she was alone, yet a shadow moved in the hallway. Adrian Moretti, the silent observer, the unseen force of authority whose identity as Mafia Boss she was only now beginning to comprehend. He approached slowly, hands in pockets, posture relaxed, but commanding, and stopped just within the doorway. "You've adapted quickly," he said softly, voice low and precise.
Alina's heart raced. His words were calm, almost casual, yet layered with meaning. I I try, she replied, forcing composure despite the rush of emotions she could neither define nor control. He tilted his head slightly, studying her, evaluating not just her actions, but her understanding of the delicate balance she now inhabited. There was no threat in his gaze, only measurement. And for the first time, Elena realized that she was not just surviving under his scrutiny, she was being acknowledged, even respected, for navigating the unseen rules of his world. Over the next days, subtle routines formed that deepened the emotional tension between them. He would offer guidance without commanding, watch her manage the child without interference, and occasionally leave small protective interventions that went unnoticed by everyone else in the house, but left Elena acutely aware of his presence. Each gesture was an unspoken acknowledgement of competence, resilience, and courage. Elena began to recognize the complexity of her emotions, admiration for his strength, fascination with his restraint, and an unexplainable draw toward a man whose world she did not fully understand, yet whose attention had become impossible to ignore. And she recognized the stakes. The mansion, the child, and her own safety were now entwined with a man whose life was bound to danger, power, and secrecy. One evening, as rain fell gently against the windows, the mansion quiet except for the soft sounds of Luca sleeping, Adrian approached her on the terrace. Lantern light pooled softly around them, illuminating his features with a cinematic glow. "You've earned his trust," he said quietly, eyes reflecting something Elena couldn't yet name. Pride, acknowledgement, perhaps the hint of something more. "And I've been watching," he added, voice layered with intensity beneath the calm exterior. Elena's breath caught, aware that this simple statement carried weight far beyond the words themselves. She realized that in this delicate dance of observation and protection, a slow bond was forming between them, one rooted in respect, tension, and the beginnings of emotional intimacy. And as the rain continued to fall softly around them, Elena understood that she was no longer just a nanny in a powerful man's house. She was a participant in a story of hidden danger, subtle trust, and inevitable attraction. A story whose climax was still unfolding, layer by layer, challenge by challenge, choice by choice. By the end of part 5, the narrative had shifted. Elena had earned tentative trust, recognized the stakes of danger, and begun to understand the complexities of the man whose attention she could neither escape nor ignore. The mansion had become a world of layered challenges, and the slow burn tension between them had begun to take shape, setting the stage for revelations, confrontations, and the undeniable pull of emotional connection that could not be denied, no matter how carefully she tried to maintain distance.
The night was heavy with anticipation, the mansion bathed in the soft glow of lanterns and the silver light of a full moon spilling across the terrace. Elena felt every step she took toward the main hall, heart racing with a mixture of fear, curiosity, and an undeniable pull she had tried to ignore for weeks. Luca had been tucked in safely, asleep with a soft smile, oblivious to the subtle dangers swirling just beyond the walls of his home, and for the first time, Elena allowed herself to acknowledge the full weight of her reality. She was no longer simply a nanny. She was a witness, a participant, and an unwitting confidant in a life defined by power, secrecy, and calculated risks. And standing at the edge of the hall, leaning casually, yet deliberately, against the polished railing, was Adrian Moretti, calm, commanding, yet impossibly human, the man whose true identity she had only partially understood until now. "You know what this means," he said quietly, voice low and precise, his dark eyes scanning her with a mixture of respect and something more intimate, something that left her breathless. Elena nodded slowly, her mind racing. She had pieced together fragments of his world, the security, the power, the careful orchestration of every interaction, and now the truth settled fully. Adrian was not simply Luca's father.
He was a mafia boss, a man whose authority and influence extended far beyond the mansion, and whose attention, once captured, was inescapable. Fear, adrenaline, and fascination collided within her, leaving her feeling simultaneously vulnerable and alive, acutely aware that every decision from this point on could alter more than her personal safety. It could shift the balance of loyalty, trust, and emotional connection in ways she had never anticipated. He stepped closer, but not aggressively. His presence was magnetic, dominant, yet restrained, a force of will tempered by subtle respect. "You've navigated every challenge with intelligence, courage, and care," he said softly, almost reverently. "You've earned more than I anticipated." Elena's breath caught. Praise from him was not given lightly. It was deliberate, meaningful, and deeply consequential. I just try to do my best," she replied, voice trembling slightly, betraying both nervousness and exhilaration. He tilted his head, allowing a brief, almost imperceptible smile to cross his features, acknowledging her competence, her bravery, and her unexpected resilience in a world she had never asked to enter but had now become irrevocably part of. The final confrontation with danger that night came subtly, but its implications were undeniable. A discreet alert from the mansion's security system indicated an outside threat attempting to breach the perimeter. Elena instinctively guided Luca to a safe room, her movements precise despite the tension, while Adrian moved with calm decisiveness, neutralizing the threat before it could reach them. The precision, efficiency, and authority with which he handled the situation left Elena awestruck, not just by his capability, but by the unspoken acknowledgement that her presence, her vigilance, and her courage were recognized as integral to the outcome. She realized, fully and irrevocably, that the line between protector and participant had blurred. She was no longer merely an observer, nor was she simply under protection. She was now a partner in a dance of survival, trust, and emotional complexity that neither of them could undo. As the night settled into quiet once more, Adrian returned to her side, hands resting lightly at his sides, gaze steady and intense. "You've adapted," he said softly, voice carrying warmth beneath its controlled authority. "And in doing so, you've earned more than I anticipated." Elena's breath caught. Praise from him was not given lightly. It was deliberate, meaningful, and deeply consequential. I just try to do my best," she replied, voice trembling slightly, betraying both nervousness and exhilaration. He tilted his head, allowing a brief, almost imperceptible smile to cross his features, acknowledging her competence, her bravery, and her unexpected resilience in a world she had never asked to enter but had now become irrevocably part of. Finally, under the silver glow of the moonlight streaming through the terrace, Adrian reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Challenge accepted," he murmured, echoing the silent tension that had defined their interactions from the beginning. Elena smiled softly, realizing that this story, once simple and mundane, had become a tale of danger, trust, and emotional intimacy where love, loyalty, and courage intertwined seamlessly. And as they stood side by side, the mansion serene around them, she understood fully that her life had changed forever. She had entered the Moretti household as a nanny, but she was leaving this chapter as a woman who had survived, adapted, and formed a bond that transcended fear. A bond forged through challenge, protection, and undeniable connection, one that promised both danger and extraordinary, intoxicating intimacy.